Thanks for being with us. She said, I'm Sarah Pulliam-Bailey. I am a national correspondent for Religion News Service. I am based in New York City. I grew up in an evangelical home, and I attend an Anglican church in New York. And I was online editor for Christianity Today for 4 years before I went to RNS. I also wanted to, so I should premise this by saying I don't have any kids. So I did, however, hold my friend's baby this morning. She's 2 months old, and I got her to go to sleep. So that I'm an expert now. So anyway, I'd just like to go down our row and just kind of flesh out who these women are who have amazing resumes. Just very quickly, though, Jamillah Karim is an award-winning author, blogger, and homeschool mom. She writes on race, gender, Islam, and spirituality. She recently published a new book on African-American Muslim women titled Women of the Nation, Between Black Protest and Sunni Islam. She holds a PhD from Islamic Studies from Duke University. And then next to Jamillah is Melissa Braunstein, who is a former U.S. Department of State speechwriter, now a freelance writer, whose work has appeared in publications as varied as the New York Times Motherhood blog and National Review Online. She is a staff writer for cultural blog Acculturated and a contributing writer for the Jewish parenting blog Kveller. And then next, on the end, Carrie Severino is a Catholic mother of 4, expecting another baby in March. In her free time, in quotes, she works as chief counsel and policy director of the Judicial Crisis Network, and in this capacity has briefed senators and congressmen on judicial and constitutional issues, is quoted extensively in the media, appears regularly on television and radio, and files amicus briefs before the Supreme Court. So she has a lot of free time, is what she's saying. So anyway, just to get to know you ladies just a little bit more, can you give us a brief overview of your current motherhood situation? How many children you have, their ages, are you working, your husband's role, et cetera, as much or as little as you want to provide for us?
Okay, so I have 3 boys, ages 6, 4, and 18 months. And I'm resigned from Spelman College after receiving tenure in 2011, and I'm currently homeschooling my children, but I also write and do speaking engagements like this one.
I have 2 daughters, one who's 3 years old and one who's 8 weeks old and is here with us and will hopefully sleep through the panel. And I'm home with them full-time, taking care of them. I also write around their schedule, and my husband works full-time outside the home, and I am basically the person who's at home.
Okay. I have 4 kids, 2 boys and 2 girls. It's an 8-year-old girl, 5-year-old boy, 3-year-old girl, and a 1.5-year-old boy. And then again, 1 more in March. I work part-time mostly from home and come in and out to DC for meetings and stuff, but luckily with today's technology you can do most things, even radio interviews and some TV things, from the comfort of my home office, which is really nice. And my husband works full-time. He's also a lawyer and works at the Department of Justice, so he's got I feel like he's the real lawyer and I do all the fun parts of the law, and then I get to at the same time be taking care of the kids, but with a lot of help from a nanny who does a lot of driving back and forth to things and assisting with the housework, which otherwise would never get done.
Great. So I just to kind of launch off this discussion, I thought I'd ask a lighthearted question. How does your faith inform your views on feminism, and how have those combined impacted your views on motherhood? And by lighthearted, I'm kidding. And how has feminism helped or hurt motherhood? So any of you want to jump in, feel free.
I'll start.
Go ahead.
I think from my perspective, a few basic things that my faith informs about approach to women. First fundamental thing is that men and women share an equal dignity, that we, were created in the image and likeness of God and are called to the same destiny of hopefully eternal life with Him, but that men and women are inherently different as well, and that's important. And one way that I feel like we were talking earlier, I think several of us kind of bridle at the term feminism even while trying to also reach out and recognize that there are many things that we agree with of goals of the actual feminist movement in terms of respect and dignity for women. I think I bridle in that many ways because I think that the difference between men and women is in fact good and is not something that we should run from, but that we should be embracing. And because it's actually a God-given difference, that if we are created in His image, then we are created purposefully, and that the differences actually reflect important things that we can learn about each other and that we can teach each other, so the different roles that we have. So a proper understanding of feminism thus can't be man versus woman, and it can't be also woman versus child, which I think is another real risk that we see in today's society, because at least from a Catholic perspective, all women are fundamentally called to womanhood, to motherhood. That doesn't necessarily mean all women are going to bear biological children or even adopt children. It doesn't mean all women are called to marriage. But it means that there's something inherent in our femininity that is mothering, that is caring for the other, that is opening oneself in a receptive way that we can see physically embodied in motherhood, in pregnancy, in nursing a child, in mothering someone, but that also spiritually women are called to do in their lives. And that's what we have to bring to the world. And that's what we should be helping them do, not trying to kind of look as much like men as possible to survive in a world that may have forgotten some of those feminine values.
I agree with much of what Carrie said. I would say that I don't typically call myself a feminist, and while I'm open to big tent feminism that would support women choosing whatever is the best path for them, I don't feel comfortable necessarily among the subset of feminists who are not so comfortable with motherhood and are not so comfortable with women like me who stay home. And because for me, being a stay-at-home mother is really a labor of love, and it's something that I've chosen to do and feel very comfortable with. I can't imagine doing anything else at this stage of my life. And as far as Judaism goes, I'd say Judaism is very supportive of that. For all of us, being a wife and a mother is very central, and the home is really the nucleus of everything for us. So while I don't always feel American society is so supportive of my choices, religiously speaking, I feel like it's never been in doubt. And as far as feminism goes and whether it helps or hurts with motherhood, I'd say it's helpful when we're talking about expanding choices for women and not judging other women's choices, especially traditional ones. And for someone who's raising 2 daughters that I intend to make sure that they're very fearless and independent, this is something that I would say I think about quite a bit, actually.
For me, my faith, it inspires an honoring of feminism, but at the same time, one based on the standards of the Quran and the prophetic tradition. And so for that reason, I claim Islamic feminism, which is a term that you find in academia and many Muslim women activists are increasingly adopting. I say that the Quran actually encourages me to promote or honor feminism because the Quran is very intentional about its focus on women and gender. So for instance, there are many verses in the Quran that state that whoever does good, or whoever is excellent in their deeds, there is this great reward. But there are certain verses where the Quran says, whoever does good, whether that person is male or female, they will receive an award. At the same time, there are verses in the Quran that I know would be rejected by mainstream feminists. And so given this conflict that, I find there's much that mainstream feminists would find agreement with, and then also some things they find disagreement with. I think that phenomenon has also made me engage feminism, and especially in terms of creating a forum or a space to be able to talk about, again, the ways that Islam does uphold many of the values that we talk about when we're talking about feminism in terms of women and men as equal spiritual and intellectual partners. I think also, lastly, what really informs my claim for Islamic feminism are the Muslim women that modeled behavior for me. And so I was familiar with feminist critiques of Islam, that women are oppressed, et cetera. But the women in my life, they totally went against those critiques of Islam. And I particularly like to mention a woman who recently passed away, Taiba Taylor, a great woman. She was the founder of Aziza magazine. She's a perfect example of someone who continues to be a model for Muslim women like myself. And she engaged these feminist critiques of Islam by creating a platform to present Muslim women, particularly, for instance, in our hijab and our garments that are normally seen as oppressive. And she took that same image and then made it beautiful, or a symbol of intelligence and agency. And so she would have these wonderful covers of the magazine that would portray this different or alternative view of the Muslim woman. And then obviously within the magazine, we were also challenging some of the gender inequalities in our own community.
That's great. So building on that, does your tradition, your respective traditions, offer any special views on motherhood? What strengths, weaknesses, freedoms, what are the strengths, weaknesses, freedoms, burdens of those views? Or how does your faith inform your parenting method?
So when you think of some of the most iconic images of Christianity, and particularly of Catholicism, maybe the first one might be a crucifix, but right up there is an image of the Madonna and child. And the mother and the child is so fundamental to our image of God's love. And I think, particularly as a Catholic, but Christians in general, we take as our model really a mother, and that is the mother of God. That's Mary, and seeing someone who was really the example of not just perfect womanhood, but actually a perfect humanity. So the Catholic teaching is that she was sort of the one human apart from Jesus who actually chose not to commit sin. And so I think it's a faith that shows how important women can be, because this needs to be a man's model as well for what it means to live as a mere mortal properly and do it well. I think it's also interesting to see the motherhood imagery we have of the love of God throughout the scriptures. You have in the Old Testament, in Isaiah, and I think these are all images that I really resonate with as a mother. Can a nursing mother forget her child? Or the infant in her breast? No, even if she would, I will not forget you. And I think only a woman who has had a child nurse can realize how fundamental that can be. And frankly, even if you literally forgot them, your body wouldn't even let you forget them. So how that's really built into not even just our psyches, but our very physical nature, that kind of thing, and then how the scriptures draw on that, as well as there's a lot of different, like a child quieted at its mother's breast, so is my soul calmed by you. So I think all of this imagery that is really made vivid by our experience of motherhood. I think also there's the understanding that motherhood is a key part of a woman's vocation. So the Catholic understanding of vocation isn't just what is your job and what are you, I think a lot of times we think of my vocation as my career. It's really, you could have a vocation to the priesthood, you could have a vocation to religious life in a celibate fashion, or you could have a vocation to marriage. And if you're called to marriage, that means that your vocation, whatever way it is your way of basically your cross and resurrection, your way of growing close to God, and the struggles that you go through in that are what's going to draw you close to God. So whatever path that is. And motherhood and fatherhood for a man is a key part of that. So I feel like I've learned more through motherhood about God, about how he views us as a parent, as a father, and it also is the way that it forces you to grow up in a lot of ways. I often say to my newly married friends who don't have kids yet, you think you're an adult now, and then when you have a child, it really forces you out of your comfort zone in a way that you could never have imagined before. You will be called on to sacrifice for your children, and for your spouse as well, really, in ways you couldn't imagine doing before, and I think also in ways that you actually couldn't have done before. That because of that experience and because of this additional person that you are, it's kind of a gift of showing you what love is supposed to be. Now, we certainly don't always feel this wonderful, warm, you know, when my son woke up and wouldn't go back to sleep at like 3 o'clock this morning, I wasn't necessarily feeling warm and fuzzy, but the fact that you're able to sacrifice for another person out of love and realizing how much you do that you would normally be not willing to, I mean, we talked about sacrifice and submission earlier, all these things that are totally transformed when you do them out of love. And I think that's what the idea of parenthood as a vocation really teaches us, that this is almost God's way of teaching us how to be mature and to be self-sacrificial and loving people. So I think that totally affects my approach, and when I do it right, it also makes me a much better, more patient, calmer parent. And then when you do it wrong, it gives you a means of asking forgiveness and returning and hopefully doing it right the next time. So.
I'd say as Jews, part of what defines us is that we accept the 613 commandments in the Torah, the first of which is pru urvu, which means be fruitful and multiply. So women are rather central to that. And being a Jewish mother is very important. We're the anchor of the home. We're in charge of making sure that everything in the kitchen is kosher, for example. And also making sure that we transmit Jewish values and making sure that there's a positive Jewish atmosphere in the home at all times, not just on holidays like today. And I'd say Judaism makes motherhood very central and very important. It's a very important role for a woman. I think the only possible downside is if you get a little bit more focused on the larger culture, where I think motherhood has been devalued in a lot of ways, and you focus on that, then you could believe the sense that it's more important to have a corporate job with a lot of responsibility and a large paycheck, and that it's less important to be home with your children. And I would argue that you're going to have a much larger impact on your children's lives than on any given shareholder. As far as how my faith informs my parenting, I would say before my first daughter was born 3 years ago, I said to my husband we were going to come up with a motto for our parenting so we would know and always remember what was most important to us. And I said I thought the 3 most important things were to raise children who were happy, healthy, and proud to be Jewish. And so that informs what I talk to my daughter about, now both daughters really, the songs that I sing and teach her, the things that we talk about in terms of the Sabbath and the holidays and the food and the traditions and sort of a general understanding of the world around her, and how we as Jews view everything around us, which may be the same or may be slightly different than anyone else that we pass on the street. But I try very hard to talk to her about how we as Jews view the world and what it's like in terms of food, for example, that while other people around us may be eating bacon and pork and that's fine for them, we as Jews do not. That's not for us. That's not what our family does. And so it's just little things like that that I would say that maybe make my parenting slightly different.
I mentioned earlier that I resigned from my position as a professor in 2011, and I think my faith gave me the courage to do that because our society doesn't teach us as women to choose our careers, or to choose, it teaches us to choose our careers over staying at home, and especially when you hold advanced degrees and you're considered in these positions of power, or these positions that historically or traditionally were not afforded to women. So why would you give that up? And what I find that in our society, motherhood is not given the regard that it should be given. And my faith does give it that regard. And there's there's a chapter in the Quran titled Women, and the verse states to fear or reverence your Lord. And then later at the end of that verse, it also says to reverence the womb. So many interpret that as, again, as a celebration of the womb, or this capacity that is exclusively women's. And other places in the Quran and also in the prophetic traditions, there is this regard for exclusively women's capacity, and that's particularly pregnancy and breastfeeding. There's a hadith or tradition of the Prophet Muhammad where it's stated that a woman who is pregnant, her reward is the same as if she is in constant prayer and fasting. So that kind of tradition really means a lot, because as all religious or faithful people, prayer and fasting, we know that those are ways to salvation, that those are forms of spirituality. So the Prophet in that case was saying that just by carrying a child, you are receiving this abundant reward in this life and in the next. So I find that that my faith gave me, like I said, it gave me the inspiration to kind of resist what society is telling me.
Great. So I want to invite you to start thinking about questions you might want to ask. We can start taking questions from you guys. So building on that, I wanted to discuss, so there's a lot of talk about leaning in thanks to women like Sheryl Sandberg and other business leaders. So three-part question: is there any virtue in leaning in or finding quote-unquote balance? What do we mean when we talk about balance, and what does that actually mean in practice? Is there any danger in taking our ideas from motherhood from the business world?
I think we all obviously have to strive for balance in our lives, but we have to have balance according to what our priorities are. So we've all alluded to the fact that women are absolutely essential during pregnancy, during nursing a child, and really during their very young toddler age, even when they're weaned. I think there's a certain just developmental role that the mothers play that really requires very involved female influence. So I think we have to recognize just the natural development of children when we look at that. And when we're trying to figure out balance, we have to know then what are we balancing it for? What's our ultimate goal? What is your primary goal, vocation and goal here? And I don't think actually, at least from my faith perspective, you don't just it's not a free open, like figure out, well, maybe my goal is to maximize my salary, my goal is to maximize my influence in the world. That's actually not, if you are, taking your, if you are called to motherhood as well, you don't really have the option of saying, I'm going to sublimate that to these other goals, because they might even be totally morally neutral things. Maybe my goal is to feed as many poor children in Africa as possible. But actually, through motherhood, you're given a specific responsibility for your own children that has to be the primary responsibility. Now, that doesn't mean that every day you have to spend 100% of the time doing that. It doesn't mean you can't do different phases at different times in your life. I've done a lot more working than I actually expected, more working outside the home than I expected I would do going into it. I had 1 year where I was actually working full time, which was something I wasn't expecting to do, but because it was an unusual opportunity to, as a Supreme Court clerk, I felt like this was something that I was supposed to be doing, and I had my mother and my mother-in-law were able to help with childcare in a way that I felt like I can do it in a way that respects the importance of putting my child first, because I only had one at that point. But I think you still, even then, have to recognize priorities in a different way. So while my co-clerks were spending more time at the office, we're going to happy hours and meeting each other, and frankly, we're maybe even spending more time on their actual work than I made it a really high priority to come home at a certain time every day, and if it meant coming in earlier every morning or pulling all-nighters instead of missing dinner with my 1-year-old, that was what you had to do. So I think when you balance the priorities, I think we have to recognize that, especially when the children are young, it is not really respectful of their development and of one's God-given responsibilities as a parent to say that's going to take the back burner, or really ever. I think we just have to recognize sometimes when your children don't need you in certain ways, and when that frees up something. That's why I was trying to capture by my free time. I'm hopefully, if I'm doing this right, I'm hopefully not saying, first I'm this chief counsel and policy director, and if I have free time from that, I'm taking care of my kids. It should be the other way around. If my responsibilities, raising my children and taking care of my family, permit it, then yes, have at it. Let's do all sorts of interesting things. Let's be engaged and let's be active in reaching out, but sometimes it might not, because the age of your children, because of the special needs of your children, all sorts of things. I have a friend whose husband's getting deployed to Afghanistan. She probably can't be doing a lot of extra stuff right now, whereas, thank God my husband's here and can help out, and so I'm freed up in more ways, so that's my thought.
I would say balance is definitely a virtue, and I would cite the first example of that in the creation story, where God took 6 days to create the world and rested on the seventh. So I think we have a divine example that we should all be resting. But as far as my personal balance, I would say there was some mention earlier of taking your life in stages, and I'd say that's how I view it. When I initially stopped working full-time in an office, after having planned basically for my whole life to be a stay-at-home mother, I actually found the reality of it a little bit challenging and different from what I had anticipated, and a little bit more lonely. And for me, over time, I'd say that definitely waned, and I'm now, I guess, back to my initial thought of being thrilled with the idea. So everything ended up working out, but I think the initial transition of going from being around people all day, other adults to talk to about adult topics, to being at home with an infant who couldn't talk to me and initially couldn't even smile was hard. But I think for me, how do I do it in the short run? I'd say I'm totally reliant on help from my husband and babysitters, and in the long run, sort of understanding that life is long, and that at this stage in my life, my first priority is my children, and that work will always be there, and full-time work especially will always be there, and that I can go back to it and delve into it much more completely when my children don't need me as much. So I'd say that's how I think of it. And as far as whether it makes sense to take advice on parenting from the business world, given how much the business world is focused on efficiencies and how children are generally not really in that column, I don't know that I'd say that I want to take advice on parenting from the business world, where everything is often can seem a little bit inhuman. So I think the personal touch is very first and foremost for me when I think about parenting, and so I would be less interested, I guess, in taking parenting advice from business gurus, and would ask them sort of to give me more tips on business.
That's great.
Yeah, I've really focused on the rest part, and I've decided that I just wanted to take a break and to forget the balancing and just leave work. But of course, I'm still working. And I think in doing that and deciding that I just wanted to resign from my job, I really do feel that I follow in the tradition of the African American Muslim women that I write about in both of my books. I talk a lot about a verse that states that men are the ones who support women, and so it's usually interpreted as men are the providers of women. And for African American women who traditionally have always had to work, since the time of slavery, they were in the fields working alongside men while they were experiencing these critical phases of motherhood, carrying a child, and still having to work, and then post-slavery, sharecropping, working as domestics in white homes, that many Black women and Muslim women have found this idea of men providing is very attractive, and especially when your holy book says so. And so I found that verse, again, as license to say, maybe this means that as women, we can take a break, because in reality, the work that we're doing as mothers is so sacred and so enormous that it only makes sense if one decides to do that.
Great. So we have some items from the audience. First is a little bit of a confession. I struggle as a woman of faith with my desires to be home with my kids with my career aspirations. I feel selfish in my desires to pursue career goals outside home while trying to be a good mom. So along with that, I think this second statement goes with that. You are all highly accomplished women by the world's standards as well as spiritual standards. Where did you find the motivation to excel in your career? Why is it important to you to excel at careers if motherhood is important too?
Yeah, I'll add too, because I left out another thing I wanted to state about how this has been a great exercise of faith, because when I resigned, I also signed a contract with NYU Press to co-write a book, which just came out. So to answer the question, how do we continue to excel given the prioritizing motherhood? One, I didn't get married until I was 28, And so, you know, I had finished my doctorate. I had almost finished completing my first book. So, yeah, so, you know, you're already established as a scholar. It's already, excellence is already something ingrained in you. You have had this time to find your passion, to cultivate them. So that doesn't stop once you become a mother. But, you know, as others have stated, it just means that there might be different ways that you pursue that or focus on that, or maybe you'll focus on that later. So I think for me, it's just that I was ready to give it up, give it all to motherhood, but it was divine intervention that said, no, you are still gonna write this book. And my husband was that vehicle of divine intervention when he said, no, I really think you should write it. When I said, no, I don't want to write, I want to rest. And so, and I knew how much work it took writing a book even before having a child. So I think it's been a great exercise in faith in that you can prioritize motherhood and also still have that vision of who you want to be, and it will manifest. And for me, it's manifesting now while I have an 18-month-old, but for others, it might manifest later on, and we should embrace that.
Well, I think as women and people generally, men too, I think all of us have many parts to our personalities and our interests, and I think that doesn't stop when you become a parent. So I think it's just a matter of at each stage of your life, how do you pursue your different interests? And for me, I knew at age 15 that my goal was to come to Washington and be a political speechwriter. That was what I applied to college as, and that's what I was going to do, and I came here to do that. And which I think most people have not decided at age 15 what they want to do with their lives. And then along the way, my ideas, I guess, about what I wanted to do and how I wanted to do it have changed. But I think for me, as far as how did I end up prioritizing my career as well as motherhood, I think growing up in my house, I was the older of two girls, and it was never an option in our household not to be the good student and not to be excelling in extracurriculars. My parents had no interest in saying, well, you're girls, your goal in life is to just be married and be, you know, the girl who's not smart enough to challenge the boys and intimidate them. That was not acceptable in our household. So I give my parents a lot of credit for that, for raising us to be sort of strong women in our household. And our models were actually my great aunt, for whom our first daughter is named, and her sister, who my great aunt was a professor and her sister was a lawyer. This goes back to the 1930s and 40s, which was really ahead of their time. And I think, you know, my parents really encouraged us to pursue our interests. My sister's a doctor, and I was always the writer, and there was never any doubt that we should pursue to the fullest extent of our abilities any interests that we had, and to pursue opportunities that came our way, and we should seek them out. And I give my husband a lot of credit actually now too. He's the one who really always pushes me. Whenever I say I'm tired, you know, we have an 8-week-old, should I go out? And he'll always say, yes, go out, do this, you know, it's your interest, you should pursue it. And he's always been very supportive. And I hope that we can model the same sort of behavior for both of our girls.
Yeah, I think I would point to my mother's example as well, kind of for both aspects of it. She had, I think she finished her master's degree in nursing while I was a baby. And so she was well educated, but I also remember that when I was younger, probably in kindergarten age, my brother was maybe 2 years old, she was teaching nursing, and she said, you know, I feel this is bizarre because I'm teaching child development, I'm missing my own children's development. And so she ended up deciding to step back and stop teaching and be a stay-at-home mom for us. And that was incredibly valuable, and I can see how much we benefited from having her presence in the home, a very articulate, intelligent, well-educated person. But it also doesn't mean that you aren't engaged in the world. She was simultaneously like fighting the local toxic waste dump that was trying to move into town and working, you know, there's all sorts of civic and political and community engagement. She was in the junior league doing all sorts of volunteering in our schools and writing grants for so there were a lot of ways that women have actually always traditionally been involved in the world. The reference earlier that someone made to Proverbs 31, I think sometimes we forget that women actually weren't locked inside their houses and not engaging with the world. I think the difference in today's society is often that there is more of a dichotomy between the working world and the home life than in many ways there was. Certainly in an agricultural society, the home and the workplace kind of were all part of the same place, and when we lived in smaller towns, it wouldn't have been as big of a thing to be helping in family business maybe while you're raising your children. nowadays it feels like it's just you're in two separate spheres. So I think that's part of what makes it seem like you have to choose one or the other. And I just want to hand it to Jamillah for taking her rest includes homeschooling 3 kids and writing a book. Like either of those sounds like way beyond a full-time job for me. So I think part of it is also, but this is also an illustration of, I think the more, I don't know, just how much women really accomplish in the world, and how it's kind of the more you do, the more muscles you build to be able to accomplish it. I know I'm actually getting way more done now than I did when I was first married and had no kids. The dinner gets on time more effectively, and I actually get the house cleaned more. Granted, I had a full-time job then, but I've got a part-time job and 4 kids now, and I think it's because you just build your muscles, and you learn how to juggle things in ways that you couldn't do before. So if you can, juggle all that and still consider yourself to be resting in a relative sense, that's a pretty amazing testament to what women can accomplish.
I also want to reemphasize that my second book was co-written, so I did half the work that I did the first time. But I think that's a great example, though, of balancing and negotiating the space.
That's great.
Oh, can I add one thing, though? I think I'm very lucky, and I'll say that up front. I think being a writer is something that's really flexible, that you can do depending on what your assignments are. I either accept assignments from clients who are willing to be flexible on when I write and when I turn things in. They don't care if I write at 2 in the morning from my dining room table, or I write for publications that don't mind if I do the same thing. So I know my sister's career as a doctor, she has to be in the hospital certain hours. It's less flexible than my career. So depending on who the questioner is, I think every woman has her own challenge depending on what she's doing. What the career track is, it either is or is not more flexible.
And actually, along those lines too, that was an insight that my mother and my father actually gave, because I was pre-med for a long time. My father's a doctor, and I saw him giving advice to me and to other women I knew, just talking about, okay, if you do go into medicine, here are the fields that do allow that kind of flexibility where you could be an ER doctor and actually have hours and then go home rather than, being an obstetrician and being on call all night long. But also then, when I was in college, when it finally came to applying to med schools, thinking about what do I want for my future life, and realizing there's some careers that are going to offer more flexibility. At the time, I remember thinking, if I didn't think I wanted to get married and have kids, I probably would go down the medical route, because that I think is really interesting to me, but it's not going to fit as well with my plans to have a family and what's something that has a little bit more options to it. So I think it's about something I always advise young women to think about. It doesn't mean you do something you don't like, but of the range of things that you're interested in doing, find one that offers you the flexibility so you can make those things your priorities, or something that you can drop and pick up later in life, rather than finding something that's very regimented.
Something that Jamillah touched on that I wanted to ask about was about stages. So some women postpone work till later in life, while some women postpone motherhood till later in life. Do you think women will have later opportunities in different stages to pursue interests and gifts outside the home? How does your faith inform how you think about timing and stages? And I'm thinking along the lines of the last panel when people were talking about at what age do you get married? What if that doesn't come for you? That sort of thing.
I mean, I think basic biology, as much as faith, informs my thoughts on that, which is that just biologically speaking, I mean, but part of the question is, a lot of women are not delaying marriage because they're like, oh, I want to marry guy X, but I think I'm going to wait 20 years because I wanted my career first. I mean, I think it's more you haven't found the right person at the right time. But it also informs when do I choose, if I am married, when do I choose to have kids versus different phases in my career. And I have to say that just sort of biology gives you a pretty big hint of actually it's going to be much easier and more practical early on. We live in a society that's sanitized and created an artificial sense of control in many ways. Certainly as a Catholic, I see our society's embrace of artificial contraception as part of that, and gives us the false impression that we have a great deal of control over all these things, when in fact a lot of it's really out of our control. I know a lot of people who thought, oh, I can just, it's like a switch I can turn on and off, and I can take a pill today and not have a baby, and I can stop taking the pill tomorrow and have as many babies as I want. And it doesn't always work that way. Sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes you think you've got the switch off and it's on, and vice versa. So I think my advice is just embrace that while you have the opportunity, because you don't really know what's going to come down the line. You don't know, maybe it turns out it takes 10 years to get pregnant in the first place, and then you start investigating adoption or other things. Whereas I feel like the career world, and that's one of the tasks that I think is set before us as kind of creating an alternative feminism, trying to help create ways that are open to women getting into the workforce in non-traditional ways, not just the day I graduated from college or from grad school entering the workforce, but recognizing that there's other paths that may include time off and raising families and things like that, so that it doesn't feel like you have to choose one or the other. If you leave the workforce today, then you can't enter.
I'm not sure that I would say that Judaism really informed my choice of when to get married. I think it was more a matter of when I met my husband and when we felt ready to make that bigger commitment. And as far as having children too, my mother gave me advice years ago saying not to have children before I knew I was ready, because she told me it would be the biggest life change I ever had, and she was right. So I think I am glad that I followed her advice not to have children until I knew I was ready. I sort of had an epiphany walking through a park by where we lived in Cambridge several years ago, looking around and wondering what the larger purpose of my life was. And I felt like I had been very professionally successful, had gone to grad school, felt like I'd been doing pretty well for myself, but it didn't really feel like there was a larger purpose. And it was sort of that light bulb moment for me when I knew that was when I was ready to be a mother, to pass on something larger and lasting and more eternal. And so I'd say, I guess you could say that sort of figured in back to my Jewish values, but as far as the exact timing, I wouldn't say I had planned it out based on what Judaism said, because if I'd been raised Orthodox and been following that track of thinking, I probably would have been married about 22 and started having children a little bit earlier, just because the first commandment is to be fruitful and multiply, and I would probably have 5 or 6 kids by now instead of 2.
So we have a bunch of questions from the audience, which is great. Here's a longer one, but really good, I think. We are privileged to be able to make the choice to stay at home, even to consider it. How do we support women whose economic realities do not allow this? How do we lobby for change in society, like affordable, excellent daycare, which is currently not available? Do our faith communities offer support?
Yeah, those are great questions. But it reminds me again, one of the statement, the Quranic statement that men are the ones that support women. So I think in our tradition, especially in the community that I'm from, there's this focus on empowering and encouraging men to stand up and take on their responsibilities. So that's one part of it. But certainly there are many women who are not in that privileged position. And I do think that that's where community and family and other support systems are really important. That, it's been mentioned that people have nannies, and then that's also part of this balancing act. And even though people can't afford that, I do think that we need to cultivate community and family support in those ways. And even, I think this also reminds me of a discussion I was having about whether everybody needs to work anyway. Like, I think, again, this over-focus and overvaluing of work, but that we actually do need people in our communities and families who actually are not working to support and help those who are working. So I think we do need to think of creative ways to make sure that if people cannot afford affordable health care, child care, that they do find alternatives right in their communities and families and with people who they might feel more comfortable with.
I think that's a tough question. I mean, we're getting a little bit more into the policy realm here, it feels like. And having worked in the government, I have to say I'm not the first one to stand up and volunteer that we should have state-run daycare. I am not someone who thinks that government is the solution to all problems. But I think if we could talk about community-level solutions, I think that would be an interesting discussion. And having read Charles Murray's Coming Apart earlier this year before the baby came, I think that's one of those topics that sort of has been in my mind ever since I read it, sort of the issue of families not being as strong now as they had been. I think that's a challenge for a lot of people because you don't have the extended family help and you don't have the strong community ties that we used to see and that used to be as commonplace. So I don't really feel like I have an answer, but I think that that's just one of those issues that really is a serious problem that we need to discuss.
Yeah, I think there's sort of two sides to it. One side, I think that maybe there's a little more obvious ways that faith can inform it, because I think there are different types of women who feel that they need to work outside the home. On one side, there's, if you've got a single mother, she clearly needs to do something to support her family. This woman needs to work outside the home and needs some way to have safe, affordable, good childcare. I think there are some churches that run preschools and have special programs and things but I think that is a real challenge of trying to find that. I think ideally there's, used to be that there was more family network that I think would support women in that kind of a situation, but and as well as religious communities that would step up. And I think unfortunately we have, maybe in part because of our reliance on the government, lost some of those community networks that we once would have had, where some of the people in your own family or in your own religious community would have been the ones to step in and help out in that situation. But I think on another side, there's also a lot of people who, when you think of we were looking at to buy a house, for example. The houses we're looking at, we had 3 kids at the time going, oh my gosh, this is just like impossibly small house that was built in the 50s or something. And you realize when you think about it, someone raised a family of like 5 or 6 kids in this house maybe. And nowadays our understanding of what do we need to provide our kids has gotten a little out of control. And I think as people of faith, it would be useful to remind ourselves that the consumerism and this understanding of like, oh, I can't afford to do this unless I can also afford to pay all my kids college and graduate level education, and unless I can afford to have them have the newest of this, that, and the other thing, and we can go to Disney every year and all this, there's a lot of things that I think we just need to recognize that actually there are different values, and it's not possible for every family, even if they were taking on more drastic levels of austerity. But I think if we, supporting each other, I see this in the homeschooling community in particular. I know there's a lot of people who don't feel comfortable with their public schools, but also they know they couldn't make it work to pay for private school, and so they've got cooperatives going together, and they are homeschooling as a financial fix to that. There's people I know that have kind of babysitting co-ops they've worked out so they can get to their appointments and get to other stuff. And more sharing those kinds of things while still being able to live on a budget. And the urban homesteading movement fits into there. So there's a lot of interesting things that go on. But just realizing that sometimes it does mean we have to make sacrifices. You can't necessarily keep up with the Joneses and spend as much time as you'd like to with your family. Even, and we're doing great, financially. But my husband, because he wants to be able to stay at home, chooses to work for the government, which means fewer hours and significantly less pay than working in a law firm, because both of us feel that for man or woman, it's at least in the DC market, the law firm life is absolutely just inhumane. And so I think there's a lot, and so you take maybe a cut on some potential income there, but the trade-off is that you actually get to appreciate your life and see your family on a regular basis that you wouldn't otherwise. So I think sometimes our faith can challenge us to take some of those steps that make things possible that we wouldn't have otherwise thought possible. But obviously, there's for a lot of people, even taking serious steps, it's not an option. So hopefully, we can rebuild some of these communities to help them as well.
So this question touches on kind of one of the points you made. How does the rise of consumerism and capitalism affect the valuing and visibility of women's work?
I think the more we value consumer goods and the issue of keeping up with the Joneses and that we need to have the newest and best of everything, the more important it is for women to work. Because who can afford to have the $1 million house and the fancy cars and the whatever other crazy expensive things you have if the woman isn't working out of the home and bringing home a hefty paycheck?
I mean, all the things that, like, of course, my grandmother grew up during the Depression, but thinking of the stuff that you would have had to be absolutely rich to have, and that they just took it for granted. They didn't feel deprived. They had a perfectly good life. It's easier when people around you aren't telling you you're deprived because you don't have the newest this, or because you have to have a hand-me-down dress for your sister, or because your grandmother sews your clothes because you can't afford to go to the department store to get them. but it does change our, our way of trying to keep up with the system.
One of these questions gets at marriage. The person asks, since marriage is a partnership, rather than saying my husband helps me, wouldn't it be more accurate to say your spouse is sharing the duties of parenting?
Would it be more accurate to say that, or is it reality? When part of why I decided to stay at home was that even though my husband was very helpful, I was the one who was responsible for cooking. But I find that to be the case for many women who are working. So it just felt like you were doing this double work, that you were working just like a man, and then at home you were doing the things that women traditionally do. And again, even though my husband and a lot of men in his generation and American men, they are very supportive. They do transcend these traditional roles of men. Still, I felt like women are doing double the work, and especially, and also thinking about the things that only a woman can do too, right? When you're adding that in, and because I decided to breastfeed, then obviously I was doing a lot more work. So I just feel that I think that we're still doing a lot of work, even like culturally. Even for very progressive men, I still feel like there's this standard of work, and again, I just decided that this is the way it is, so I'm just going to make things a little bit easier for myself. That was my approach.
I'd say my marriage is definitely a partnership, but my husband and I still have fairly traditional gender roles, so if I was the one who said that my husband helps me, it's probably just, I take the questioner's point on the choice of language. It is an interesting question to raise about the choice of language, but since I'm the one who spends the bulk of my time doing childcare, and my husband definitely spends a lot of time with our daughters and does a lot of, interacts with them a great deal and is very involved with them, but simply just has a lot less time to do it. I guess if I was the one who said that, I would say it just because I think of myself as being the one who's sort of the primarily their person most of the time. But I would say, yes, my husband is very equally involved when he's there. There's no doubt in my mind that we're equal parents.
Yeah, I have to say I kind of agree with both. I mean, there's a certain, even in a modern world where you have a modern relationship in many ways, I think there's still, and I don't know if this is sort of like a biological imperative or if this is just so culturally ingrained, but it's very hard to completely ignore the default gender roles in a family, and partly because they are, to a certain extent, especially with the really young children, the mother is going to be doing a lot of it. So I think it also, I could say I help my husband pay the bills, and he helps me take care of the kids. In fact, ultimately, if he lost his job, it would be all on me. I mean, between the pair of us, we have to get it done, one way or the other. And there's a lot of times when if I have to travel for work, he gets to do 100% of the stuff with the kids. So there's there are times when one or the other might take on a bigger role. But maybe our language needs to change. But I think it's harder to change some of the fundamental assumptions than it seems. Sometimes I feel like we're fighting kind of the innate way of things are going. So it might be easier to just accept that to a certain extent that's going to be how it is, and how do we work best with it, as Jamillah was saying.
So I think this will be our last question before we conclude. If someone is struggling to find a spouse, how should she deal with the emphasis faith places on motherhood?
I say to fully embrace the moment that you're in. And of course, it's easier to say that when you're married and you have kids, because, but I was there. So like I said, I was single until I was 28. So I understand how it can be difficult, but to embrace that time. And our Islam does not say that you have to be a mother to be an important person or a servant of God. So even if you never become a mother, don't feel like you have missed out necessarily on some, on who God wants you to be, and that is the path that God has chosen for many women, not to have children, and that there are other wonderful things that they will pursue and achieve.
I agree. Being a good person is not necessarily, there's no inherent connection between being a mother and being a good person. They're two independent, although hopefully overlapping things, if you were drawing a Venn diagram. I think in Judaism there's the concept of the beshert, which is the person you're fated to be with. And I know in my personal case, my husband and I met each other and then didn't end up getting together for several months because each of us was just not in the right headspace to be dating the night that we met. So I think there's a lot to do with timing, and that everything will work out in its own way, and that a lot of times God has a plan for us that we don't necessarily understand, that can be frustrating when we're living it. But I think my husband and I looked back after we met and got together and realized, oh my goodness, we were basically following each other up and down the East Coast for so many years. We knew so many people in common, how did we never meet? So I think I wouldn't, it's true, once you're married and have kids, it's easier to say don't worry so much, but don't worry. I'd say, like, turn it over to God and you know, just know that there is a plan, and whatever it is, it'll work out.
And I guess I'd point back to the first, there's a lot of biblical examples of even in these many cases married women, but who did not have children and for so long felt burdened by this as suffering, whether it's Hannah or Elizabeth or stories, and then eventually were blessed with a child that had a very special calling. And so I think sometimes when things don't happen in the time frame we think they're going to happen, we assume it's just because God doesn't want them to happen, and that's not necessarily the case. He may have something very special planned. But that's not, again, to say that everyone is actually called to marriage, and I think that's one thing that I really appreciate about the Catholic tradition. I was brought up evangelical, and I felt like there was much more of a pressure of, like, you must be called to marriage, at least in the church that I was brought up in. Whereas I think recognizing that we're all called to spiritual motherhood, and not just when you're, you know, of childbearing age even, and we should all be looking for opportunities everywhere, whether it's in or outside of your family, for who am I being called to mother in this situation, you know, whether it's in your office or in your community or different places. So focus on that aspect of it, and you'll be doing what God's calling you to do at that moment.
Thank you, ladies, and thank you guys for the good questions.
All right, thank you so much. Those were 3 awesome panels. Just to do a little summary, and for those of you who are on Twitter, you may have seen that if you follow the hashtag FaithFem, you can see sort of what people thought were highlights, and there's a lot of great stuff on there. But a few things that really stood out, I think, and this was very encouraging to Asma and I, because the idea of personal stories and personal narratives as vehicles for these conversations is very important to us and what we're doing. And I think a lot of different panelists talked about that as a way to talk about difficult issues and to share the different ways that our faiths overlap about these different topics. We heard about sort of the problem of competing understandings of feminism and what does that mean as we try to you know, bring our own perspectives to feminism from our faith backgrounds. Another thing that I think people commonly talked about was the idea of role models, both women looking to other women for role models, but also finding models within our faith. A couple of things that were very popular were, you know, on Twitter was the idea of, or the fact that Jesus sent out a woman to proclaim the gospel, and also the Prophet Muhammad as somebody who had very positive relationship with strong women. On our second panel, we heard a lot about interfaith marriage, and not just that, but also different levels of piety within marriage, and then intra-religious diversity as bringing different challenges to modern marriage for men and women of faith, and then also a discussion about delayed marriage and the different challenges that brings for women, especially women who are living out chastity, and the idea of finding vocation in singledom. That seems to be a common theme across different faiths. And then the challenges of raising children, especially in a highly sexualized culture. And then on our last panel, I think the idea that modern society is lacking when it comes to helping women to find both guidance and empowerment in motherhood, and that is really something that faith brings to the table from all different faith backgrounds, and that women have sort of a common journey in experiencing motherhood, whether it's in the very sort of concrete ways like breastfeeding or the more abstract ways And then just a discussion about men and shifting to think more about men finding and looking to their own faith to find ways to balance the same things that women are dealing with today. So, Osma, I'll turn it over to you, but thank you so much to all of our wonderful panels and moderators.
I hope you enjoyed today's program. Creating a more inclusive feminism is a project that requires deep commitment and reflection. The conversation is vital, and we encourage all of you to partake in it through our future events, and even more importantly, through our magazine. You can submit pieces to us at altventuresmedia@gmail.com. Many thanks to the Berkley Center, World Faiths Development Dialogue, Melody Fox Ahmed, and Crystal Corman for their collaboration with altFem on this conference. And a special thanks to the amazing Monse Alvarado who put together this wonderful event. Thank you.